So this is like it's a terrible conundrum for some people. It's not for me, right? Because I think, I see myself as anti-racist, right? I for a long time, as a person who grew up in Louisiana, during the 70s and 80s, been involved in all sorts of anti-racist politics, right? And so, as a college student at Southern University in Baton Rouge, like a lot of other folks, I am going around in the state, particularly in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, going door to door, trying to get Black people to turn out to stop the election of David Duke, right? Who sought statewide election twice, right? He ran for the state Senate position. He also ran for governor of Louisiana. He lost because of high Black turnout and also because of, progressive minded whites who didn't feel like he should represent the state. And so my politics have always been anti-racist, but having grown up in a majority Black working class context, having been pretty much in Black institutions exclusively until I became a graduate student, um, class politics within the Black community and Black population, I should say, not even community, is real, right? And it's something that many people don't necessarily want to talk about or scrutinize in any really serious way, right? And so I think we should be able to talk about police violence against civilians in a way that is clear about the class character of it, and not just the violence against civilians, but the violence of the carceral apparatus more generally, right? What it does to people's families and lives, and the kinds of life chances that they have. So I think we should be able to talk about that, right? I don't see that as antagonistic towards an anti-racist position. I also think that the truest anti-racist position, if we go back to the kinds of arguments people were making during the antebellum period, and even throughout the Jim Crow period, is to reject the idea of race as somehow a real thing, right? I mean, we can talk about Black people as a people, who have a common history, have sort of some common cultural signposts in different moments. But to talk about African Americans as a race is problematic, even in this moment, right? Because many African American activists, many African American intellectuals throughout the history have rejected the idea of race, right? They've seen it as a denial of the individuality of African Americans, a denial of our capacities, a denial of our complexity and diversity. And so we've gotten away from that, right? Particularly in a moment where, it seems like the response that many of us have to growing racism is to double down on race, right? And to use it as the place where we stake out our battle. But I think a better fight for us is to build a broad-based set of coalitions, right? Broad-based set of social forces who aren't just dwelling on our differences, but thinking about the life that we want to have in common, and many of the forces that we're feeling in common, right? So most people in the society right now are struggling with debt. Many people are house poor. Many people are facing tremendous amounts of uncertainty in terms of their jobs and their futures. I think it's especially compounded among younger people, and I'm the parent of three adult children. And when I listen to them and their friends, they're inhabiting a world that's frightening in some ways, right? There's a potential within that, across race and ethnicity, across different regional divides, to build something else, right? To build what we thought we saw or glimpsed in the midst of that Bernie Sanders moment and other social struggles over the last decade or so. But I think we have to be serious about that, right? I think we can do both, right? I mean, I haven't met too many people on the left who are like, well, they're for racism, right? It's sort of like, it's kind of an odd thing that we're in, where if you bring up class, you talk about capitalism, then somehow you're not paying attention to race. It's just sort of an odd and distracting debate that I think is driven primarily by a lot of social media stances that people are taking, and some academic turf wars, right? Where for some people if you challenge their position on race, which is like their bread and butter, they have to come back and claim that you're being class reductionist or you're not paying attention to the things that matter to them because they're worried about their market share more than anything.
I mean, I guess I wanna agree with you that it's kind of a stalking horse and that there's no real segment of the left that is in fact
Mhm.
a class reductionist. However, as much as I have personally spent a lot of time arguing against people who accuse the left of being class reductionist and have written extensively in defense of the left as non-class reductionist, I do think that there is a cohort of the left, I think a minority of the left, that does kind of bristle at the centering, or I would say the need to acknowledge contemporary ethnic silos as part of their coalition building efforts, and who will say, look at the overwhelming majority of Black voters voting for Joe Biden, his victory in South Carolina as mediated by Jim Clyburn, with a frustration that doesn't then yield some kind of desire to understand what's going on there culturally. It comes out, it yields a kind of uh defeatism almost, where the Black voters are sometimes written off discursively, and there's no interrogation of how those outcomes could be changed, and sometimes even a dismissive attitude toward those voters as kind of patently uninformed or stupid, as opposed to having priorities
Right.
that are different, and that if you want a coalition build, you're going to have to figure out how to potentially change or reorient, right? And
Sure,
so
sure.
the fact sometimes of Black voters being one of the few kind of political coalitions that exists in a real way, that sees itself as a voting coalition, sees itself as a voting bloc, and is a more fixed voting bloc than other racial groups at a time when there is, of course, low union density and all of the barriers to having the same kind of um, labor for the kind of labor persuasion on the political process that we used to have in some historical periods. So it makes me a little reluctant sometimes to say, oh, well, let's give up on that the value of that racial coalition. When I see the 2020 protests, there's a part of me that says, yeah, I don't, we definitely need to be speaking about police violence and these things in terms that are more inclusive of non-Black people, particularly given some of the stats around how many Latinos are affected by police violence. But I also think I do maybe want to capitalize on the fact that this voting bloc might be persuaded to say, hey, Joe Biden broke his promises to the Black community. Withhold your vote unless you get something specific. What do you make of that? Do you feel any of that tension between a desire to make a coalition that's much bigger and more powerful than just a Black voting bloc, and the reality that in the short term there is some value to that bloc?
Yes. So I've written about the South Carolina election, the primary, the importance of the South Carolina primary in the past. I think I agree with you, right? That there are complex reasons why people supported Biden. Um, that it's not, we shouldn't just dismiss people. And I've heard people make that argument as well, that, these are Black people who are not paying attention to, they're not connected to left politics. They don't understand certain issues. They're voting for Biden, even though he's not going to help them. I've heard people make those sort of dumb arguments, as you have. I don't agree with them, right? I actually think that people who voted for Joe Biden, and I'm saying this as as somebody who was all in for Bernie Sanders back
Mm.
then, I think people voted in ways that we can't really, they're like when we all vote, right? There's a variety of reasons why we support candidates. It's not always just how they align with our racial sensibilities or how somebody else might characterize those, right? I think people voted for Biden in South Carolina because he seemed to be the more sensible and perhaps more viable candidate. And they live in a state which is dominated by Republicans, right? They also live in a state where that was really the only chance to register a vote that would matter, right? Because in the general election, Democratic votes in the South Carolina election don't really matter, right? In that particular state, it's not going to matter in terms of determination of the electoral college vote. And so I think that was a way of signaling for many people, maybe not all, that they thought Biden would be the more viable person. He also had at his disposal, um, much more in the way of trusted brokers, right? And this is not to dismiss anybody who was representing Sanders at the time, but it's tough to build support within the space of an election cycle.
Right.
And James Clyburn has been there forever, right? And he is trusted by many people. He provides divisible benefits to folks who live there. And I'm talking, and I've, as somebody who grew up in the South and knows how these things work from the grassroots level, right? It's like we had politicians in Louisiana who were total scoundrels, but you could trust them to give jobs, right, to people, jobs to youth, right? They would do these sorts of things. That matters to people in a way that a stop and drop campaign is not going to change or alter, right? And so my sense is that people in South Carolina did what they thought was right. But I'll say this, and no offense to South Carolina is the wrong place to look, right? If you look at a place like Chicago, we just elected somebody who was a Black teachers union organizer, somebody with a very clear left politics, who was supported by Black people, right? And so I think that's another problem we get into. We use examples like South Carolina, which was great and important during the context of a Democratic primary season, but not so much when it comes to national politics and even where we want to look for progressive possibilities. I mean, Brandon Johnson was able to pull together all sorts of people across the city of Chicago to support him. Again, I think they supported him for different expectations, different reasons. And now he really has his work cut out for him. The other thing I would say, I mean, having lived Black ethnic politics going on, I'll be turning 52 this summer. I don't see it as the most trustworthy place to stake out our claims, right? I'm more concerned with organizing people and being in communion with folks who share the same values and the same interests, right? When we look at the Black population now, this is an example I'll give you. On any given issue, right, you can find Black people on both sides of it. So if it's the matter of school privatization, right, you've got Black folks who are all in for school vouchers at one point. They're all in for charterization. So you can't really use, even in terms of coalition building, race as a proxy for interests, or think about race as somehow being synonymous with constituency, right? When we're talking about real interests, right? The same is true. Just one other quick example. I mean, even on this matter of policing and carceral power. I mean, and when you say this to people who are like, hardcore abolitionists, or people who are like really committed to particular Black Lives Matter fronts, they get upset if you say that, a lot of Americans, including many Black people, have pretty strong supportive views of police. And that's maintained itself all the way through these waves of mobilization, including George Floyd protests, right, in 2020. So I say that not to dismiss the predicament, but simply to say that if you really want to try to build forces that are capable of changing the society, right, in terms of policing and incarceration, you got to think about how to transform those sentiments, even among Black people, right, who have legitimate reasons for wanting police protection, right? Because many communities are still facing violent crime, right? Even if it's declining nationally, if we look at national numbers, many of the places I've lived, are still suffering from waves of homicide and other
Yeah,
crime.
there's a lot there. So let's break into some of that.
Sure,
You
sure.
you describe the support of police as consistent despite and throughout the 2020 protests. But in fact, as you wrote in your book, it wasn't consistent. There were ebbs and flows that corresponded with the force of the movement and the movement's ability to convey the overreaches of the
Mhm.
police department, the cruelty of the police department, the various events that have been caught on camera since 2009 or so, in the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, have chipped away at public consciousness and trust in the police force more broadly than the distrust that has existed within the Black community for a long time, and reflected in everything from Black literature to rap music, etc. And that there was a time during which the Minneapolis Police Department was burned down, and the majority of the American public supported it. And then over the course of 2020, a number of factors, I would argue, including Joe Biden's election,
Mhm.
and the fact that the abolish movement was perceived to be and was actively marketed by the Democratic Party as undermining his ability to beat Donald Trump, caused people to revert to the mean. But to me, and that is true, and everything you say about there being plenty of support for cops' desire to have more policing in Black communities, um, by Black people,
Mhm.
there's a diversity of opinion there. That's obviously true. But the fact that that opinion can be affected
Mhm.
by the kind of movement that we saw in 2020, and the fact that the kind of mainstream abolition movement is so relatively new, the fact, as you described, that so many of these Black cities, as Black leadership emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, felt disadvantaged by coming of age at the end of the kind of prime industrial period and the post-war period. We're dealing with deurbanization, white flight, all of these factors, had a legitimacy crisis, felt a lot of
Mhm.
pressure to do something about the problem when alternatives to police weren't really forthcoming.
Mhm.
All of that to me says describing the reality at present doesn't have that much of a bearing on what the solution should be as we look forward. That being said, I wonder what you make of the increasing division even within the left political context. I mean, the real left, not like the Democratic Party left, about how to address policing issues. We've had recent controversies where some prominent hosts of the Young Turks have been critical of, let's call it, soft on crime tactics, who have
Mhm.
been um, arguing for, quote unquote, getting homeless people off the streets. I don't want to mischaracterize anybody, but talking about homelessness, poverty, crimes, etc., in a way that many other leftists felt to be at best unsympathetic and at worst
Mhm.
kind of right wing. But this has
Right.
become increasingly common. And the critique of the left by these other leftists is to say that Black people, brown people, poor people are disproportionately hurt by urban crime. Having a laissez-faire attitude toward it is bourgeois. People who don't really even live in the cities are the ones saying that you shouldn't do anything about the homeless problem, etc. I don't know how much of that discourse that you've seen, but to the extent that you're familiar
Mhm.
with it, or that summary is good enough to go off of,
Right.
what do you make of that?
So let me go back to the part about the support for police, right?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely right. So during the summer of 2020, as I point out, there's a moment where we reach a majority. First time the majority of Americans who are polls basically say that they support Black Lives Matter, and the basic premise of Black Lives Matter, that African Americans are disproportionately targeted by police for unfair treatment and for violence, right? That's different though, right? To say that people are supportive of Black Lives Matter's premise is different than their support for police. And we actually saw that, throughout that, um, even that disappeared, right? The support for Black Lives Matter disappears by the end of the summer, by the time we see the shooting of Jacob Blake. Um, Support for policing sometimes is disconnected from that, right? I mean, I think people can in one moment be opposed to the clearly unfair and brutal killing of George Floyd. And at the very same time, say that when it comes to their police department, they want to see it continuously funded, right? We saw a lot of that So I think it's important to kind of disentangle some of that. I also think, just in terms of the George Floyd protests, a lot's going on there, right? It's sort of like, on the one hand, it is a response to his killing. It is a moment where many people who are already politicized, kind of re-enter the streets again and push again for many demands they've been working on for years, right? Going back to the Obama years. But it's also a moment where I think, many people are participating for reasons that have very little to do with George Floyd and very little to do with the core arguments of Black Lives Matter faithful, right? So one way to think about it, and I mentioned this briefly in the book, is that what we saw, during the early, part of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we're all stuck in our houses and we don't know what the world's going to look like, what we lost was the valuable sort of third space, right? So, we all have our space where we work, we have our households, our family life, and then we also have that third space of social life outside of those places, right? Where we build connections with our friends, where we do activities that are meaningful to us, date and engage in all sorts of other things, right? Religious practices, whatever else. We lost that, right? Because we didn't confine to our house. And what the George Floyd protests did for some people, right, it provided that legitimate and kind of permissible way of being back out in the streets again, right? Back together and in communion with many other people. And so, when you attended some of those protests, it was like a celebration, right? People are out. It's almost like a festive thing. It was also spring, right? It was us returning to life in parts of the country where we had endured not only COVID-19, but also winter, right? So I think there's a lot of motivations. And maybe one of the more important things is that people are also rejecting, if you go back and look at the multitude of protest signs and paraphernalia that was created, people are also rejecting the Trump administration and the climate of social meanness and racism that he had kicked up and created, over the course of his term. And so I think George Floyd was the catalyst, but I think that moment is, it's almost irreducible, right? There's so many different things that are going on over the course of the summer, and people are participating with different motives, in mind, even if that's the uniting, thread.
I think that's true, but I guess I'm unclear about what that means or why that matters. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.